My name is Karen Bell. I'm a senior lecturer in sustainable urban development in the Department of Urban Studies at the University of Glasgow. The University of Glasgow has been very impressive in its work on the sustainable development of cities. In fact, it came second in the Times Higher Educational Rankings for its contribution to SDG 11, which is about cities and communities in relation to sustainable development. Environmental justice is particularly my topic. I've written several books on the subject. And the concept of environmental justice originally came from the United States in the 1980s, where Black and minority ethnic communities noticed that the toxic facilities, the hazardous facilities, always seemed to be in their neighborhood. And they were saying, well, why is this happening? Why is it always in the Black and minority ethnic neighborhoods? And of course, that was considered to be anecdotal because we didn't have the statistics at the time. But people went out onto the streets, they campaigned, they protested in front of lorries that were bringing toxic waste into their community and dumping it by the side of the road. And they just generally made a big campaign of it, and they began to use this word, environmental justice. After that, academics started to get interested in this, like Robert Bullard, for example. And he looked at, can we monitor this? How is it looking statistically? And they found that there was actually a relationship between where these hazardous facilities were and the prevalence of Black, Asian, and minority ethnic groups. So the people were right about that. And it became quite a policy area for the Clinton government at the time. And they passed an act which said that you shouldn't put toxic facilities disproportionately in these areas. And then the concept of environmental justice went global, and it's been taken up in all parts of the world now. There's environmental struggles everywhere. I mean, there have been environmental struggles everywhere for centuries, but we haven't called it that. But since we've had this framing of environmental justice, it's much easier to think about, to campaign about, to do academic research about. So environmental justice has these key three aspects. It has a substantive aspect, which is about your health and the quality of your environment and the policies that go along with that. It's got a distributive element, which is about how the environmental goods and burdens are distributed among the population in relation to specific social groups. So originally, we were talking about Black, Asian, and minority ethnic groups, but we've also looked at class, income, disability, gender, age, and tried to see if there's a pattern of who gets a good quality environment and who doesn't. And there also has a procedural element, which is about whether you have a say in the quality of your environment. Are you consulted? Does your consultation really make a difference? How are you consulted? What information are you given? So, for example, in Europe, we have the Aarhus Convention, which says that everybody should be proactively involved in environmental decisions that affect them. And we know that doesn't happen. And this is where you can get a big gap between the policy and the law and what actually happens in practice. And within that gap, there's a big space for campaigning, for research. So we've got these three aspects, substantive, distributive, procedural, and they can apply to different environmental issues. So you could be talking about green space. Why is the best green space in the richer areas of the city, for example? You could be talking about food. Why do we have food poverty? Why do people have to go to food banks? Why can some people afford organic food and other people can't? You could be talking about water quality. Who has access to water? Who can afford to buy water in bottles in a disaster and therefore survive the disaster where other groups can't? So there's an enormous amount of questions in relation to environmental justice. And so it's a very interesting topic. You can take it wherever your interest lies. You could be thinking about transport. You could be thinking about pollution, which is a major issue in terms of environmental justice. For example, we had the case of the 9-year-old Ellie Kissy Deborah in London who died of asthma because she was living next to a busy road, and her mother had said for years, we need to do something about the traffic here. And it was actually the first case in the UK where they actually managed to prove that somebody had died because of pollution that was the responsibility of an authority, which was basically the City of London. So that was a groundbreaking piece of legislation. So the field of environmental justice it's incredibly exciting. There's a lot happening. It's really important because it affects our health, whether we live or die. We also have different levels of it. So you can have a local level. You could be looking at a city. You could even be looking at as narrowly as an estate, which I've done in my own research. You could be looking nationally and comparing the patterns nationally, or you could be comparing internationally. So there's a lot of work to be done within countries and between countries of who gets what. So you may have heard of the idea of climate justice, which is a kind of element of environmental justice, but it's focusing on the climate, and it's asking questions like, who's responsible for this climate crisis? Because really it's the countries of the global north. It's asking questions like, who can survive and who's going to be most impacted by the climate crisis? Who's the most vulnerable? And who is most in a position to come out of it okay? So wealthier people that can afford insurance, for example, are not going to be so badly hit. And then also, what about the policies associated with climate? Some of the policies have been rejected by poorer people. For example, we had the Gilets jaunes in France who took to the streets and said, we don't want you to have these green hikes in the fuel because we're forced to the outskirts of the city because we can't afford to live in the centre. So it's disproportionately going to affect us. So policy justice is another important part of environmental justice. There's a lot more I could say, but hopefully that's whetted your appetite for the topic. And thanks for listening.